November 11th, 2018 marked the 100-year anniversary of World War I. Now seems a fitting time to think about the lessons we learned from the two world wars of the last century and look ahead to preventing the massive losses of life that might result from a third world war. We have been, since the Second World War, in what's been called the Long Peace, or the New Peace, since the end of the Cold War. The Long Peace is the absence of war between major world powers, coupled with a statistical downward overall in casualties and fatalities in civil wars and military conflicts. But some have argued that this peace has become tenuous at best. With the resurgence of populism and nationalism across the world, it's easy to worry, how long can the long peace last? So what would happen if a third world war broke out? In this video, we're going to look at the possible loss of life if the great powers of today's world were to go to war. Let's look at it this way. We don't know who would start it or who would be on what side, but we can safely say for it to be a world war, the major players might include the US, China, Russia, UK, Canada, Australia, India, Pakistan, North Korea, Japan, South Korea, and the EU, meaning all known nuclear weapons would be implicated if not in use, and depending on the nature and location of the conflict, would additionally include some combination of countries from Africa, South America, and the Middle East. Antarctica would probably stay out of it since it's ruled by a benevolent council of penguins. Since we don't know much about the nature of World War III given that it, thankfully, has not happened yet, to think about the possible loss of life, we'll look at historical data from the First and Second World Wars and advancements in weapons and technology since then that tell us what a modern world war might look like. Let's start with the previous world wars. First, I'll take a cue from Neil Halloran's incredible video detailing the loss of life during World War II and mention that when we talk about casualties in war, we're talking about a combination of people who died and people who were injured or for some other reason unable to fight and taken out of battle. In this video, we'll mostly be talking about fatalities or deaths. But if we talk about casualties, know that that means both the dead and the incapacitated. So for example, World War I had 40 million casualties. Estimates say somewhere between 15 and 19 million people died between military and civilians, and another 23 million military personnel were injured. Of those millions, between 8.5 and 10.8 million were military deaths. 2.25 million civilians died due to military actions and crimes against humanity, and another 5.4 to 6.1 million civilians died due to war-related famine and disease. This means altogether around 1% of the world's 1.791 billion population at the time died in World War I. World War II was even more brutal, with 60 million civilians and military personnel killed, totaling 3% of the world's population at the time. Of those, between 21 and 25.5 million were military deaths. 29 to 30.5 million were civilian deaths caused by military action or crimes against humanity, and between 19 and 28 million civilians died due to war-related disease and famine. It was a horrific war, and it's no wonder that seeing such a terrible thing launched us into a time of peace. Looking at it in today's terms, let's assume that another world war would mean at least the same percentages in lives lost. Today, the population is 7.5 billion people, up more than threefold since the last World War. If things look the same as the first two World Wars, the death count would be somewhere between 82.5 million and 225 million people. But the Second World War had a much higher death toll than the first, and we've come a long way since then in terms of our technology, both benign and weaponized. Assuming that the percentage of the world's population killed in the hopefully unreal next war climbed at around the same rate as it did from World War I to World War II, it could be anywhere from 5 to 9% of the world's population, which is anywhere from 375 to 675 million people. When you hear those numbers, it can be easy for them to sound like a statistic. So let's look at it this way. 675 million people would mean every man, woman, and child in all of the United States, Pakistan, and Japan, the world's 3rd, 6th, and 10th most populous countries, and all of Belgium too. Every single resident of those countries killed without exception, and that doesn't even take into account the other portion of casualties. Imagine just as many people injured or otherwise incapacitated if the other world wars are any predictor. But let's say we learned something, and this war didn't include as many civilian deaths. Removing crimes against humanity and civilian deaths due to military action entirely, the toll of World War II would have been 1.7% of the world's population, or 127.5 million people in today's numbers. What does that mean? The entire population of Tokyo, Beijing, New York, Delhi, Moscow, and Mexico City entirely wiped out. It's a scary thought. And being realistic, no war would be free from crimes against humanity and military atrocities against civilians. So let's assume there would be atrocities committed. Let's say that's the sort of thing that would get the world into a world war. War on the ground seems unlikely, because unlike the first two world wars, it would probably not be between neighboring countries, but rather between powers spread out across the globe. But if it became a proxy war, as some might predict, you could expect to see extremely high casualties, as in World War I and World War II, usually as many or more people than in the military. So let's say on the ground fighting, not including crimes against humanity, could result in another 100 million dead. And then there are the mass civilian casualties, the crimes against humanity. Today, though we've signed treaties against developing and using them, we have advancements in biological warfare and nuclear weapons, which could cause mass injury and death. On the other hand, we also have advanced technologies that involve no traditional weaponry at all. Cyber warfare would be a large part of any next world war. You could expect to see a war fought in space for control over communication and drones doing battle in the air. Silicon Valley would be a more likely target for attack than the manufacturing plants of 20th century wars. It's hard to say from this vantage point what new technologies would emerge to fight the next world war, but we know in each of the prior world wars the face of war shifted dramatically. In the First World War, tanks were invented and introduced, photography and sound recording took on a new role, and the German army began using mustard gas, introducing chemical warfare to the world, something they developed further and used to horrible effect in the Holocaust. The Second World War brought a higher importance to the Air Force. Radar was used for the first time, propaganda played a much larger part in broadcasting government messaging to the people, and of course, the atom bombs that in essence ended the war were developed and used, remaining the only time nuclear weapons have been used at war in our collective history. Which brings us to the biggest threat to civilian life in a World War III scenario: the hydrogen bomb. The atom bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are tiny compared to today's weaponry. As many as 226,000 people died in the bombings and immediate aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A single hydrogen bomb is up to 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs used in Japan. And the world is more densely populated today than it was in the 1940s. If even a single hydrogen bomb were dropped on any city, you could expect massive losses of life. Whereas the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki destroyed everything in a 1-mile radius, the hydrogen bomb decimates everything in at least a 5-mile radius, or 78.5 square miles, and up to a 10-mile radius, or as much as 314 square miles. For reference, all of Washington, D.C. is 68.34 square miles. That means not only would DC be destroyed, it would be burned to the ground, flattened, cease to exist, as would everyone in it, immediately, in the event of a hydrogen bomb being dropped on it. It would mean 700,000 people at minimum, not simply dead, but gone. Wilfred Burchett, the first Western journalist to visit Hiroshima after the bomb was dropped, wrote, "Of thousands of others, near the center of the explosion, there was no trace. They vanished. The theory in Hiroshima is that the atomic heat was so great that they burned instantly to ashes, except that there were no ashes. Shanghai is 2,448 square miles, so let's say it only destroyed 78.5 square miles of the urban center. The population density in the heart of Shanghai is 20,000 people per square mile. You can safely assume one hydrogen bomb doing the least possible amount of damage would kill no less than 1,570,000 people, and as many as 6.2 million. As many as 6.2 million people erased completely in the span of a moment. And if a hydrogen bomb were launched at your city, what would that look like? In the US, the siren system that was in place to announce a 4-minute warning to a nuclear bomb dropping was taken out of use in 1992, so you wouldn't hear air raid sirens like in the movies about prior wars. If you're in America, well, remember that presidential text you got? What do you think that system might be used for? Today, you'd get a text. You'd have at most 3 to 4 minutes to surround yourself with concrete, cover your skin, and hope you're far enough from the center of the blast. A flash and boom. Then, if you're lucky enough to be far enough away, the waiting. The nuclear fallout. Maybe a death later from radiation poisoning, or much later from an associated cancer. Your city, not just in ruins, but gone. So let's take a look at those numbers all together. Assuming World War III looked something like World War II, you could anticipate, depending on the exact situation of the war, around 62,750,000 military deaths, 66,750,000 civilian deaths related to famine and poverty, 80 million civilian deaths due to crimes of war and military action, at least, totaling 209.5 million people at minimum. And again, if World War trends upward in terms of percent of population eradicated and in terms of ratio of civilians to military killed, it could get even uglier. The world has the weapons today not just to eradicate cities, but to eradicate all life on Earth. The threat of World War III looms. Every day it seems someone somewhere is saying something that sounds awfully risky. So what prevents it? What can prevent nuclear bombs dropped on densely populated cities, drones dropping bombs on military targets, and, let's assume, civilian targets as well, because war is messy and atrocities are inevitably committed. Our collective memory of the horrors of the last World War, is it fading? Well, don't go panicking just yet. There are reasons for hope. Our economy is more globalized than ever. We are inextricably linked to each other. And that's good. Tying our economic health to one another incentivizes peace and helps us learn about each other. The more we know, the more we learn to tolerate other cultures, and vice versa. The mutually assured destruction that kept the Cold War cold remains in effect. The reality is that no one wants mass casualties in their home, and that we all know that unleashing the worst of what we're capable of could mean erasing the species entirely. Anyone with even a modicum of self-preservation instinct would hesitate to unleash the foulest of our weaponry, if only to save their own hide. And so, in the event of escalating international tensions, we'd likely make use of the technological advances that aid us in preventing large-scale deaths, if not always used properly. Drones, technological warfare, the kind of war that is largely waged behind a computer screen and in the air. As I stated at the beginning of this video, civilian and military casualties have been trending downward. Maybe we love peace and not dying. Maybe we're getting marginally better at keeping war between the powers that want to fight it, and not the sons and daughters of the large swaths of the world that just want to be left to live their lives peacefully and happily. It's possible a third world war could come to be. It's possible. If that happened, we'd see significant losses of life. But, as with everything, it depends on the decision-making of those in power. So what can we do? We can look for wisdom in our leaders, restraint and careful consideration, and hope others will do the same. We can bring to our own worlds each day tolerance and kindness. And we can try to support the long peace in our own small ways. If we all do that, maybe we can keep the casualties of World War III at zero. Work together to imagine and build a world where the idea of a world war is antiquated, unthinkable, a thing of the past. Let's remember the lessons of the first two world wars and keep the third one the stuff of zombie movies and science fiction novelists, because no one wants to go extinct. If you enjoyed this video, then why not subscribe? Hit that bell icon as well so you're more likely to get notified of our noble answers to your burning questions. Also, if you have any questions you want answered, make sure to tell me in the comments section down below. And to keep filling your brain with regal knowledge, check out these videos here. They're magnificent.